All right, we're going to review a few ways we can solve quadratic equations. The first one is by factoring when a equals 1. So let's start off with an example. Let me get my pen. Let's say we have negative 2x cubed minus 8x squared minus 6x equals 0. So the first step is to rewrite it in standard form. And we also need to take out the greatest common factor if possible. And we need to make sure that our a is always positive. Right now in our standard form, my a is negative 2, my b is negative 8, and my c is negative 6. I definitely need to make this a positive, and I also want to see if there's a factor I can divide each one of these numbers by in order to simplify this. So in fact, all of them are even. All of them, if we haven't noticed already, also have an x. So what we can do is factor out a negative 2x from each term. By doing that, we now get x squared, and so our coefficient here would be 1, but it's also positive, which is nice and friendly. All right, and then if I divide by negative 2x here, I get a positive 4x, and then if I divide by negative 2x here, I get a positive 3. Now I can factor out this trinomial. I still have this negative 2x out on the outside. And the easiest way I like to do it is to create this little T-chart here of your A times your C and your B. So that way it helps me come up with my factors of what my A times my C is. So if I take a look at my new trinomial, my A is 1, my B is 4, and my C is 3. So I'm looking for two numbers that will multiply to get my A times my C. My A times my C, 1 times 3 is 3, and my B is 4. So two factors that multiply to give me 3, but will add to give me 4. And those two factors are 3 and 1, because 3 times 1 gives me 3, but 3 plus 1 gives me 4. So I want a positive 3 and a positive 1. So now I've factored. Now I have to set each factor equal to 0. Well, I got negative 2x equaling 0. If I divide by negative 2 and divide by negative 2, I get x equaling 0 here. This is a possible solution, x equaling 0. For this one, now I've got x plus 3 equals 0. When I solve for this, I subtract by 3 on both sides. X equals negative 3 is a possible solution. X plus 1 equaling 0, subtract by 1 on both sides. X minus 1 gives me x equals negative 1, which is a possible solution. Because we have an x here, when we set it equal to 1, it was possible to solve. But if I just had a negative 2 on the outside, and then I set it equal to 0, negative 2 equaling 0, well, that's not possible. So we wouldn't have a solution here. But because this x is here, we are able to divide by negative 2 on both sides. The 0 divided by negative 2 gives me just 0. So now I've got 3 possible solutions. And I would want to plug everything in now to do a check. So if I plug 0 in for x all the way across the board here, obviously I'm going to get 0 equaling 0, which works out. If I plugged a negative 3 in for all of my solutions, I would get a 0 equals 0, so that would check out. And then if I plugged in -1 for all of my x values, I can show you. Let's do that one together. All right, -1 cubed gives me a -1, but -1 times -2 gives me a +2. -1 squared gives me a +1, but a +1 times a -8 gives me a -8. -6 times a -1 gives me a +6. And then if I combine all of my like terms, 6 plus 2 is a +8, but -8, I get 0 equaling 0. So that checks off. All right. So again, my solutions are 0, -3, and -1. Let's try another one. Let's do a quadratic when factoring, and we're going to factor it, but this time a does not equal 1. So let's try an example. 15 minus 5x equals 10x squared. All right, we're going to rewrite this in standard form. What I'm going to do is I want to make sure that my a is positive, so I'm going to bring everything over to the right. So I'm going to add 5x on both sides, and I'm going to subtract 15 on both sides. So I have 0 equals 10x plus 5x minus 15. All right, so my a is positive. Now take out the greatest common factor if possible. I can see that 5, I can divide by 5 across the board here. So let's factor out a 5. All right. So now at this point, I want to figure out kind of my reverse FOIL here. My factors that will multiply to my a times my c, but add to my b. So I create this little t-chart. You don't have to put this t-chart in if you don't want to. Sometimes it's just easier to organize your work. So my a times my c. So my a is 2, my b is 1, my c is -3. So a times my c gives me a -6. My b is 1. What are some factors that work out here? So pause the video, try to find some factors that work out. And what we can find is that 3 times -2 gives me a -6, but 3 plus -2 gives me a +1. So I'm looking for a +3 and a -2. Now here's the difference. When a does not equal 1, it's easier when you factor to keep the a in the binomial and then simplify the binomial if you can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep a with x when I factor it out. So I'm going to put a 2x here and a 2x here. This is just the way that I find it a little bit easier, okay? So now that I found my factors and I put my ax in, I'm going to simplify my factors, my binomials, if I can. So I'm going to look at this binomial and see if there's anything I can divide both this term by and this term by and get something that's divisible by both. In this case, I can't simplify. There isn't a number that's going to give me a nice, friendly, divisible number at the end. So I'm going to go over here. Is there a number I can divide this binomial by for each term and get something nice and friendly? And I can divide by 2 in both of the terms in this binomial. And by doing that, I simplify the binomial. So let's rewrite it. Divide by 2, divide by 2. So now, if I were to FOIL this back out, I would get my original trinomial, okay? So I just have to simplify my binomial if I can. All right, so now I set each factor equal to 0. So 5 equaling 0, well, that is definitely not a thing. That's not possible, so that's not a possible solution. 2x plus 3 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 3 on both sides and divide by 2 on both sides. So we do have a possible solution of -3/2. And then I'm going to set this guy equal to 0. I'm running out of space here, but I'm going to write it over here. We do have a solution if I add 1 to both sides of 1. So our possible solutions here are -3/2 and 1. Definitely plug these guys back in for x in the original equation and see if you get the left side equaling the right side, but it will check out if you do. All right, completing the square. Let's do an example of this here. So you want to use completing the square when you can't easily find the factors, and it is easier to rewrite it in a perfect square trinomial to solve for it. So we're going to use the example. X squared plus 8x plus 2 equals 22. All right, I want to put it into this format first, which means my c is going to just be on the right side. So I'm going to subtract 2 on both sides. Rewriting this, I get x squared plus 8x equals 20. And then I need to figure out what I'm going to add to both sides of the equation. I have to add to both sides to keep the equation balanced, but I want to add it so that way that I get a perfect square trinomial on the left-hand side here, because I have an a, my a is 1. I have a b, my b is 8. What I'm missing is a c. All right, and that c is what is going to be added to both sides. In order to figure out my c, I'm going to take the b coefficient, divide it by 2, and square it. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So I'm going to rewrite this, adding 16 to both sides. And then I'll simplify that right-hand side there. All right, so now I've created a perfect square trinomial, which means I can factor this out. And in order to figure out what goes in here, it's actually always going to be your b divided by 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. Because I have a positive b, it's going to be a positive 4. All right, so now we can simply solve by square rooting both sides. We can solve by the square root. So if I take the square root of the left, it cancels with the square, and then I'm going to take the square root of the right. So I get x plus 4 gives me a positive or negative 6, because the square root of 36 is 6. And then I'm going to subtract 4 to both sides. So I've got x is positive or negative 6 minus 4. So if I were to kind of separate this out, I've got a positive 6 minus 4, and then a negative 6 minus 4. So I get a solution of 2 and a solution of negative 10. All right, awesome job, guys. So in the next video, we'll get into the quadratic formula. Again, these are all different ways to solve for x. These are our x-intercepts. This is our solution. So we talk about the solution as our x-intercepts or our zeros or our roots, our solution. It's all the same thing.